I beat Mega Man 3 in one sitting without taking any damage. It finally happened after a long effort. In this video, we will cover the rules for the challenge, the routing decisions behind the run, and discuss the attempts that eventually ended in the successful run. This video is a summary of the run. You can find the full run in the video description. Here are the rules for this run. In previous videos for this challenge series, I spend more time reviewing these rules, but for brevity's sake, this run is performed real-time by me on an actual console with strict rules. No turbo controller, no major glitches, and most importantly, no damage allowed. If you'd like to hear more about the rules for this challenge in general, check out one of the earlier Mega Man Challenge Run videos. I recommend Mega Man 9's video. Let's talk about Mega Man 3 as a whole first. This game introduces many mechanics, many of which stick around for the series in various lengths. This game introduces the slide, which is a movement mechanism for Mega Man, and drastically changes the gameplay from Mega Man 1 and 2. This game also introduces the idea of a second set of stages after the 8 Robot Masters, but before the final Wily Castle stages. In this game, the Robot Masters from Mega Man 2 make a reappearance, known colloquially as the Doc Robots. Mega Man's dog companion Rush also makes his debut in this game, which provides a ton of movement utility for the rest of the series. Mega Man 3 is known for being a very hard run for all challenge types of playthroughs, specifically for speedrunning and no damage challenges. Why is that? Well, there are a number of reasons. First and foremost, this game is very input heavy. Mega Man's slide is shorter in this game compared to pretty much all future Mega Man games, which simply means it takes more slide inputs to move around a similarly lengthed screen. Further, regular enemies generally do not have invincibility frames, which means that the fastest way to defeat enemies is often to mash them down. Coupled with the fact that the charged Mega Buster hasn't been introduced yet, the player is often mashing the B button a lot throughout the game to defeat enemies quickly, which is especially true with speedruns of this game. Another difficulty of playing this game is how much this game lags and slowdown management. We will see later that I use slowdown to my advantage during some parts of this challenge, but generally the game slowing down can be very difficult to navigate for clean and consistent inputs. And finally, part of the reason this game is so hard is how difficult some of the bosses are, with their complicated patterns and huge damaging hitboxes. We'll get into that soon enough. Let's begin talking about the route. Later we will review the run stage by stage and get into granular details, but for now we will discuss the route for navigating this game. For some of the more complicated fights in this game, I'll discuss them in this section, but overall the stages themselves can be discussed during the run review later. The challenge begins with the format of selecting a path from the 8 Robot Masters. Mega Man 3 notoriously has a ton of flexibility in which route you can opt for. The Robot Masters in this game have many secondary or even tertiary weaknesses, so there are tons of potential routes when trying to play safely and consistently. However, there are some major checkpoints for deciding the initial set of stages to choose from with only the Mega Buster. The first consideration is usually which Robot Master is reasonable to defeat with the Mega Buster only, consistently without taking damage. These include Magnet Man, Gemini Man, Top Man, and to a lesser degree, Hard Man and Snake Man. Spark Man and Shadow Man have complications that make them pattern dependent to fight without any special weapons, and although Needle Man is technically possible with Mega Buster only, it is extremely hard to do consistently well, and there's no reason to. Another consideration is how hard the stages are themselves. Thankfully, Mega Man 3's Robot Master stages are not very chaotic, and even with Mega Buster only, a lot of them can be cleared consistently. However, Rush Jet is a major asset that can be acquired after Needle Man's stage, so that is definitely part of the consideration. Ultimately, the choice comes down to trying to maximize consistency, doing the harder stages first, and routing in getting the most out of the special weapons for later stages. The major checkpoints in the early game come down to Gemini Man's stage difficulty, notably the first screen and the Pen Maker section, the Needle Man fight, and the Shadow Man fight. With all of the above considered, Gemini Man is chosen first because of the difficulty of his stage, but also how the stage is reasonable to finish with Mega Buster only, including the fight. Gemini Man is at first an intimidating boss, but with some knowledge he is reasonably clearable. There are 2 phases to the fight. The first phase is a consistent execution test where the player must keep him in a loop. Afterwards, he starts moving around the room. Gemini Man will fire a Gemini laser either 180 frames or 255 frames after walking around the room, uninterrupted by the player pressing the B button to cause him to jump. I developed a method to get him to move consistently in the second phase, then I would react to one of the two patterns. If he only fires one Gemini laser, the fight is quite manageable. After Gemini Man, Needleman is second, who is both weak to Gemini laser and also awards Rush Jet. Needleman's fight is very challenging. Because of his weakness, Gemini laser slows down the game a lot. The player has to be ready to basically move at full speed and slow down speed at all times. I developed a method to walk up to Needleman at the beginning of the fight, then react to whether or not he jumps high or low. Afterwards, the final two hits are a bit of a scramble. He can have some real nasty patterns such as 2 small jumps with projectiles, but he can also be very easy. Rush Jet from Needleman's stage allows fighting Shadow Man consistently, and Shadow Blade is a great utility weapon for the rest of the Robot Master stages. Shadow Man's fight is one of the more unique fights in the game. Shadow Man has an extremely hard AI cycle to avoid taking damage while on the ground, where after 3 jumps, he will either do his Shadow Blade attack or he will do a very fast slide, and there's no way to tell which one is coming. Fighting him with Rush Jet makes the fight reasonable, but it is still hard. The player has to routinely jump on Rush Jet, where when Mega Man isn't physically on Rush Jet, no ammo is consumed, so the player has to learn how to manage Rush Jet ammo while actually hitting the boss and dodging. I would get tripped up on this fight now and then, but with practice it was mostly consistent. After these 3 have been defeated, the choices open up once again, and at this point some of the stages come down to pure preference. Snake Man is a relatively difficult stage, and with Rush Jet, Shadow Blade, and Needle Cannon it can be completed, so it comes next. In Snake Man's stage, Rush Jet helps skip past the large, snaky mini-bosses simply by leaving the screen early. Snake Man's fight is a somewhat chaotic fight, but he does move consistently based on which pattern he decides to do. Over time, I flowcharted pretty much every situation, and with good preparation the player can handle any outcome. But again, slowdown can be difficult to navigate, especially if the player accidentally defeats one of his search snakes and changes the speed of the game. Many fights against him come down to a well-timed slide under him, which can be scary, but it was the best way I could handle him. Sparkman's stage is pretty simple, but Sparkman himself is a moderately challenging fight, so that comes next. Sparkman opens the fight with 1 to 4 jumps. If he happens to jump 3 times, it is required to switch to Rush Jet to avoid the attack, which is one of the few instances in the game where Rush Jet is strictly required to avoid taking damage. I tried many ways to do it without Rush Jet, but I found none. The point is that if he jumps 3 times, or jumps twice, then once, the player has to be ready to switch to Rush Jet to dodge. Otherwise, good preparation can handle his very telegraphed attacks. Both Snake Man and Sparkman's weapons are not particularly critical for the rest of the stages, but because their stages and fights are more difficult than the rest, it makes sense to do them up front. Finally, the flow of weaknesses from Magnet Man into Hard Man into Top Man is the reason to do these final Robot Master stages in this order. Both Magnet Man's and Top Man's fight are quite simple and don't require much explanation. Hard Man's fight is pretty challenging technically, but perfectly consistent every time if the player performs the fight correctly. Having Magnet Missile is extremely helpful to end the fight as fast as possible. Afterwards, the game moves into the Dock Robots section, where 4 stages are available to choose from in any order. Technically, the order doesn't matter because the player already has all the special weapons and rush movement options, but in many ways, choosing the order for this set of 4 stages was one of the harder considerations. When doing this sort of challenge run, there are 2 major considerations. The first is that the generally harder stages should be done earlier, so that if something goes wrong, the player can reset early and try another run, as opposed to putting off the harder sections for later. The second is about managing the player's nerves, which is a very significant thing for this challenge. Because of some of the very difficult parts, trying to control your nerves after successfully doing a hard part is extremely difficult. So there's 2 paths of thinking: either do the hard parts early so you can reset more efficiently, or do the hard parts later so that you don't have to deal with the pressure of trying not to make a mistake after doing one of the hard parts. Ultimately, I took a combined approach. Dock Needle is one of the harder stages in the game, so I opted to do this stage first. But Dock Spark is the hardest stage in the game, which we will cover in depth soon, and because it is so difficult, I opted to do it last because the pressure of not messing up after doing such a hard section is too immense. At the end of the day, it doesn't technically really matter because you have to do all the stages no matter what, but attitude and nerves management is extremely important for finishing this challenge, so it is not a trivial consideration. All of the Doc Robot fights are complicated and worth explaining in detail in this section. Doc Needle stage comes first, which features the first of the Doc Robots, Airman. This fight is intensely complicated and is a major barrier for the run. In particular, there is one pattern from Airman that is unavoidable without using Rush Jet. Because of this, Rush Jet has to be aggressively used to avoid all patterns in the event that the undodgeable pattern occurs. This ends up being fine because Rush Jet is nice for general movement during this fight. The approach to this fight evolved over time as part of the challenge routing, but in its final form, the general goal is to squeeze in a few Mega Buster shots on Rush Jet during Airman's first 3 tornado patterns, then to perform a setup when he switches sides to get in as many hits with his weakness as possible and end the fight aggressively. He is weak to Spark Shot and Magnet Missile. Spark Shot is used because of ammo efficiency for the stage. This fight requires a ton of practice to get used to narrowly dodging the tornado patterns. I used to fight this battle much more passively, but when I realized that I could stand to the left of Airman after his side switching for a bit, I began practicing a much more aggressive approach to the fight, and in general it was much better in the long run. Clashman is waiting at the end of this stage, which is another complex fight. Clashman begins his fight by walking back and forth and does not take his first action until Mega Man shoots. After, he will jump and shoot a Clash Bomb, walk for 150 frames, then repeat. However, if Mega Man shoots while Clashman is walking around, that timer stops and he does a jump and shoot cycle, then the timer resumes. Because of both of these, he can get into chaotic patterns very quickly. It is worth noting that if Clashman jumps and shoots while a Clash Bomb is on the ground, he shoots nothing. The final strategy to fight him ended up being consistent but still somewhat pattern dependent. Wait for Clashman to start walking right, fire 2 hard knuckles as he walks right. Then, an interesting technique is used. Clashman technically jumps when the player presses the B button at all, so I switched to top spin to press B to force him to jump without doing anything, which allows me to press the pause menu directly after, which baits a jump from Clashman and gives me time to switch weapons and shoot the 3rd shot. The 4th and final hard knuckle is tricky. Based on the timing cycles described before, Clashman will be very close to doing his automatic jump after 150 frames of uninterrupted walking, so a preemptive jump and hard knuckle closes out the fight. That's the first of the Doc Robot stages. Next I chose Doc Shadow Man stage because of an aspect of the Heatman fight. But the next Doc Robot Master is Woodman with his classic leaf pattern. The strategy I employed was to safely use Rush Jet on the left side of the screen. He takes 7 hits of Needle Cannon to defeat, so the plan is to use Rush Jet to dodge the first incoming attack, then hit him twice, back on Rush Jet, then hit him 3 times since he is closer, then Rush Jet, and then finish the fight. The left side of the screen is generally safe in this fight, but it is definitely a close quarters situation, so precise and careful movements are necessary. Heatman is at the end of this stage. This is one of the easiest fights in the game, with the major exception of the start of the fight. In order to avoid taking damage, the player has to do an immediate slide into a short but not too short jump at the beginning of the fight. It's especially difficult because of how the game lags. Something worth discussing is how in Mega Man 3, when a slide is executed, Mega Man cannot jump out of his slide immediately and must wait a handful of frames before he can jump again. In other words, the player has to time the jump out of the slide not too early so that the jump happens at all, but not too late so Heatman's incoming attack doesn't connect with Mega Man. Further, the timing of how long to hold the jump matters a lot, where either a too small jump or full jump will result in getting hit by Heatman. So it all comes down to a gut feel kind of jump at the beginning of the fight, and it's not trivial. However, once this slide jump is executed successfully, the rest of the fight is won by simply staying far away and attacking safely. The next stage is Doc Gemini Man, featuring a somewhat scary first screen, but Patience gets through it decently well. The next Doc Robot Master is Flashman, yet another very complicated fight. Flashman will follow Mega Man around, and if it hasn't been apparent already, the Doc Robot Master's sprites in this game are huge, and their hitboxes are also huge, meaning that being in close quarters with them will often result in getting hit. Flashman will freeze the screen and attack Mega Man with a homing attack that sometimes doesn't track well. After some development over time, I came up with a strategy on Rush Jet to bait him in a very particular way, which maximizes the potential to deal damage to him safely. It is not trivial to swap weapons during any fight in this game safely, because of how much delay there is for Mega Man being able to resume movement after getting out of the menu. Summoning Rush Jet takes time, and the player really only gets one chance to jump on Rush Jet. So the strategy became to fire one shot of Needle Cannon, barely squeeze in a Rush Jet summon, bait Flashman around the room in such a way that when he's walking to the right, the player can dismount and fire in just enough needle cannons to close out the fight. It is a perfectly consistent fight if you don't mess up any of the small things to do it all correctly. Bubble Man is waiting at the end of the stage. Bubble Man opens with a 1, 2, or 3 bubble pattern. The strategy is to open the fight with a nearly full jump and switch to Rush Jet. If Bubble Man fires 1 or 2 bubbles, you can safely fall to the ground, but if he fires 3 bubbles, mashing pause a few times allows the player to barely dodge the incoming bullets that Bubble Man fires when Mega Man is on the same horizontal level. Once the first pattern is dodged, for whatever reason, Bubble Man's AI completely stops working while Mega Man is on Rush Jet, so the fight is very safely fought on Rush Jet. It's very nice that this is the case because Bubble Man would be a fairly hard fight without this challenge. The final Doc Robot stage is Doc Spark. As discussed before, this stage is so hard that I put it off until the end so that I didn't have to feel the intense pressure of every other Doc Robot stage on successful attempts. The first fight here is against Metal Man. Metal Man functions somewhat similarly to Clash Man before. He has an internal timer where after a set amount of time, 120 frames, he will jump and fire metal blades, then repeat. But again, if the player presses the B button, this interrupts Metal Man's pattern and he jumps and shoots out of cycle. Generally, the fight comes down to firing a magnet missile, reacting to his pattern by sliding and walking left, then repeating. But because of the automatic timer situation, I would typically wait for Metal Man to take his own action routinely so that he didn't get into an aggressive double jump situation mid-fight. These kinds of considerations are extremely important. I did some assembly level programming research over the course of routing and playing this game to understand how boss patterns work, and it paid off immensely for fights like these. And finally, we're here. If you watched any of my live runs, you'll know this one, Doc Quickman, single-handedly the hardest fight in the game, and probably the single hardest fight in all of classic Mega Man to do consistently without taking damage. Let's review what's going on here. On every pattern, Quickman jumps 2 to 3 times at wildly different angles and will shoot 3 quick boomerangs on either the first or second jump, then he will walk aggressively towards Mega Man and repeat. The sheer number of possibilities of patterns that this Robot Master can do is enormous, and there's no way to get him to cooperate consistently. A few other notes. The quick boomerangs he throws will be fired towards Mega Man, and then they will return back towards Mega Man's position. They also have massively large hitboxes themselves, way more than one would expect. So all in, because of his incredible movement speed, completely random patterns, and the gigantic hitboxes on his own body and his projectiles that track you twice, it's easily the hardest fight in the game. So what are your options to fight him? Well, thankfully he does take 4 damage to his weakness, so it takes 7 hits to defeat him with either Search Snake or Gemini Laser. Although the game being laggy and having slowdown is disadvantageous or simply annoying to deal with in pretty much every other case in the game, in the Quickman fight, the player must use intentionally lagging the game to slow down the fight so that the player can react more reasonably in real time. So the strategy is to fire Search Snake shots to force the game to slow down. 3 Search Snakes can be fired at once on screen, so the idea is to shoot 1 to 2 of them to force the game to slow down, and the final shot can be used to damage Quickman. What does this look like in practice? An incredibly difficult fight where the player is shooting random Search Snake shots left and right to slow the game down, while trying to assess Quickman's ridiculous patterns and damage him. Let's not forget how hard it is to adjust with time compression, where the game is fluctuating its speed while the player tries to move around consistently. It is super hard to do well. Another consideration for successfully completing the fight is to bait his quick boomerangs appropriately. In some ways, this is the hardest part of the fight because of how dangerous they are with their auto tracking and giant hitboxes. The strategy is to move with Quickman as he jumps, so that when he fires his quick boomerangs they go straight down. In the case that Quickman does a small jump and Mega Man is directly under him when he fires quick boomerangs, they will despawn entirely, which is a massive benefit. But it's much easier said than done. It cannot be overstated how hard it was to practice and deal with this fight. I had many runs that made it to Quickman without taking damage, only for him to obliterate me. There are some opening patterns to the fight where the player is almost guaranteed to take damage, but thankfully that did not happen often to me. Most of the losses against him were to ridiculously hard reaction timings or just unfortunate situations. After all of that Doc Robot Master discussion, the route moves on to the Wily stages. In contrast to the Doc Robot stages, the Wily stages are actually incredibly simple for routing, and the boss fights themselves are not overly difficult. We can discuss them in the next section of this video during the run. It's worth noting that at the very end of this game, Wily stages 5 and 6 are quite easy, and there's no major challenge in defeating the final boss, thankfully. However, as with every challenge run so far, the Robot Master refights are incredibly hard and stressful, which is in Wily Stage 4. With that, let's get into the run. The journey starts in Gemini Man stage. The first screen has a ton of Nitron and Bomber Pepe enemies, but after a while the section is pretty consistent, even if it's somewhat hard. The next major challenge in this stage is the Pen Maker section. These guys were a major consideration for routing in the very beginning of this challenge, but over time I found a method to defeat them. The idea is to jump, fire 2 buster shots, then land and fire 1 buster shot to cover for any spawning small pens. With good timing, the strategy will always work, but the difficult part is to make sure that you don't overfire, because Mega Man can only have 3 buster shots on screen at once. The long screen at the bottom of the stage is definitely tricky to learn, but after a while, with good movement and baiting the Yambo Dragonfly enemies to move consistently, it's not so bad to do. Gemini Man's fight goes well in this run and we move on. Needle Man is up next. This stage was a run killer early on in attempts. The second screen, the long horizontal one, has a lot of challenging met placements that block your path. I developed this set of movement principles to get through it over time. Needleman's fight here was a fairly easy one, with 1 jump with his needle cannon attack, then he jumped long. His projectile attacks caused the game to slow down considerably, so movement has to be very carefully executed when the pattern is tough, but that wasn't a problem here. Moving on to Shadow Man stage. This stage starts off with 1 of 3 Proto Man fights, which are very consistently clearable without trouble based on his pattern always being the same. The stage is home to one of the worst regular enemies in the game, Mecha Kero. These small frog enemies have ridiculously small hitboxes and they are spread throughout a number of stages. They appear in Gemini Man's stage before, but they are more problematic here. The large horizontal stretch here is fine when played carefully, and the final stretch of the stage is cleared with Gemini Laser. Shadow Man's fight features Rush Jet, and as discussed before, after a long war of attrition he finally gets whittled down. Off to Snake Man, one of the harder stages in the game. The first screen features the bouncing Dada enemies, which definitely ended some runs over time with their somewhat chaotic movement patterns. Petite snaky enemies will fire a homing shot after spawning on screen, so careful movement can route their bullets. The large snaky mini-bosses can be skipped simply by using Rush Jet, but even if the player needed to fight them, they aren't particularly difficult. Shadow Blade and Rush Jet get a ton of utility in this stage, especially Rush Jet in the final screen. It's worth noting just how good Rush Jet is in this game. The ability to conserve ammo while jumping is so helpful. Snake Man gives me one of the more common patterns here, where the player has to slide under Snake Man. It's still difficult because of the slowdown and the timing of it all, but I move on. Sparkman's whole stage is fairly straightforward, especially with Rush Jet to help out. There really aren't any major challenges. Sparkman himself gives me a nice 2-jump pattern, which is arguably the best pattern to see since he's in the middle of the screen and it's easy to dodge his spark shock. Moving on to Magnet Man, which is probably the easiest stage overall. Another Proto Man fight, and the rest of the stage is cleared with some more Rush Jet usage. The final screen in the stage with the giant Springer enemy is a little tricky. This enemy is deceptively difficult with the projectile it spawns. The projectile tracks Mega Man, but it also behaves kinda strangely, so it's important to slow down and deal with this enemy. Magnet Man has a very simple fight, and although he has two different patterns between jumps, they are both very manageable to dodge. Hardman's stage is next. The Havsu B enemies can be despawned with good movement on the first screen. Similarly, the returning Monkings in the stage can be dealt with by getting close to them to force them to jump, then navigating around them without having to fight them at all. Proto Man's final fight in the 8 Robot Masters is here, but by spawning Rush Jet at the beginning of the fight, it is once again a trivial fight, even on this terrain. Spark Shock helps bypass a Bicky at the end of the stage. Hardman himself is a technical fight, but it is always consistent if the player moves consistently. This method I developed helps set up a reasonably fast kill, but it also sets up Mega Man to be in a position to do the same exact strategy in reverse in the event that one of the magnet missiles did not connect. I rarely had to do this, and I didn't in this run, but it was helpful for some runs. There's a ton of subtlety in the strategies I would develop that may not be visually apparent, where something might seem basic or obvious as a strategy, but it was in fact covering for multiple outcomes from the boss. This Hardman fight might look simple, but it was the result of quite a bit of work. The final of the 8 Robot Masters stages is Top Man, featuring the blight that is Mecha Kero on the first screen. They can be reasonably dealt with by going slow, but they are super annoying when they get out of hand. Again, they have extremely small hitboxes, so they are hard to defeat. Search Snake and Gemini Laser help deal with the stage enemies, and the Tama mini-bosses are melted with Magnet Missile. The final screen sees Rush Jet again for safety, and then Top Man guards the end. Top Man's pattern is also basically the same every time, so carefully baiting his top spin projectile attack and using Hard Knuckle for major damage finishes the 8 Robot Masters stages. 8 robots in this game are fairly easy, as most of the stages themselves are pretty trivial, but that is about to change fast. Off to Doc Needleman. Gemini Laser is used on the hairy enemies, then Rush Jet and Coil get used on the next screen. This method of Rush Jet into buffering right direction is especially nice because the stage hazards spawn in a perfectly consistent line, and there's no chance of getting sniped by them when simply holding right. Airman is the first boss here. He opens the fight with some patterns where I can get some chip damage in, but in general these patterns are pretty rough. There is one pattern he can use where he forces an unblockable attack if you don't have Rush Jet out, and there's another pattern where Mega Man can slide under the tornadoes and get up to 3 hits for free. Neither happened in this run though, and with the Spark Shock setup in the top left corner, he goes down. I lost a run to Airman earlier that day of attempts, so I was ready for him this time. Afterwards, Rush Jet gets a lot of use to clear the screen, and baiting Yambo to safely not hit Mega Man is especially important here. The giant Metal mini-bosses go down easily to Shadow Blade usage, and I use a setup on one of the long horizontal screens to force the Metal DX to fly down instead of up. There's some weird direction routing things that happen when Mega Man is on the edge of the screen in this game, so I use it to my advantage here. Clashman guards the end of this stage. His jump arcs are random, but his movement pattern is always the same, so there is some pivoting to be done, but it's mostly consistent, and it goes well in this fight. Off to Doc Shadow Man, which has some somewhat scary stage hazards, but Rush Jet once again helps save the day. The first fight is against Woodman. By the time I was this far into the challenge, Woodman was very rarely a problem, and this fight went well. This fight is another example of a fight that looks simple, but I routed it in such a way that if I miss a hit on Woodman during the first 3 cycles, I am positioned to deal with an extra hit before the 4th cycle starts, though that wasn't used here. Some Magnet Missile and Rush Jet over the long horizontal screen at the end, and we have never have to see Mecha Kero ever again. Heatman comes down to the slide at the beginning of the fight, but afterwards he's no trouble and I move on. Doc Gemini Man is up, and the first screen is played safe and slow. Magnet Missile sometimes tracks enemies strangely, so it's important to make sure that it connects. I would move around the screen in such a way that I would bait the Jamasi bug enemies to fully despawn before I targeted the flying Nitron enemies, so that the Magnet Missile tracking didn't get messed up. I used a technique during the egg section where I opened 3 eggs to spawn 3 pole enemies on the right. Only 3 poles can spawn at a time, So while those three are spawned, no more eggs will spawn a pole, so I can safely navigate for a little bit around close quarters eggs. Flashman is next, and I used the setup mentioned before to take him out. In this particular fight, when he was walking right, I only shot him once instead of twice, so the end of the fight was a bit of a scramble, but it worked out with some patience. The rest of the stage is pretty straightforward, but it does importantly feature everyone's favorite Rush Marine. Bubble Man is at the end, and I actually mistimed my jump to dodge his pattern, but it ended up being recoverable. If I didn't jump again shortly after at the beginning of the fight, I would have most likely gotten hit by his bullets. The final Doc Robot stage, Doc Sparkman. The stage itself is not a major threat, but the section with the Elec N enemies must be cleared very methodically to be safe. Metal Man guards the checkpoint, and I played this fight relatively safe. One of the last patterns almost got me, the small jump with one metal blade, but I managed to scrape by. The second half of this stage is very easy with the Bolton and Nuton enemies, but what is not easy is the Quickman fight at the end of this stage. Again, hardest fight in the game by miles. I intentionally start the fight with Search Snake to lag the game, and it goes well for the first cycle, but he starts the second cycle with an empty jump where he very infrequently will not jump towards Mega Man, and if he threw boomerangs I would have instantly lost, but thankfully he threw boomerangs on the second jump. This fight was especially scary, but I managed to slow him down, jump over him, and clutch it out. I might sound like a broken record, but this was truly difficult and it was not easy to be prepared for this fight in general, especially not on a run that was on pace to win. A quick battle with Brakeman where Rush Jet and Buster Shots wreck him. Entering the Wily stages. Only 6 more to go. Wily stages 1 through 3 are a little bit of a breather after all the pressure of the Doc Robot Master stages, but it's not easy. Rush Marine gets its final use in the sewer section against the Pen Pen Navy, then Rush Jet safely navigates the rest of the stage. Kamegoro Maker is Wily 1's boss, and it is one of the few times we can use Topspin safely. The whirlpools sometimes spawn in dangerous places, and if Mega Man awkwardly lands on a whirlpool while using Topspin, he will instantly lose all temporary invulnerability and will definitely get hit by Kamegoro spawns. But it worked out in this run. Wily 2 is up next. The stage itself is extremely straightforward, and Rush Jet clears out the Have-Su-Be enemies without any trouble. Weapon energy routing is basically a non-issue in the Wily stages in this game, but staying near maxed on Rush Jet will help for later. Yellow Devil Mark II guards the end of this stage, and he's back from Mega Man 1. It's a little easier this time, but I use a specific setup to hop on Rush Jet twice to navigate around his patterns. There are more aggressive strategies you can do to end the fight more quickly, but they are way more dangerous, and I opted for a fairly safe setup. It all comes down to timing the Rush Jet summons and lands to get from the right side to the left. It was an uneventful fight, but still my nerves were very highly strung for this run. The next stage is Wily 3, a very simple stage with only a few screens. Say hi to Final Joe, the Hammer Joe who is seemingly guarding nothing. The boss of Wily 3 is Holograph Mega Mans, a surprisingly hard fight to get right. They are very weak to Search Snake and only 4 shots are needed. But in order to do this fight without taking a hit, the initial platforming must be done without any small errors, or you won't make it in time. One of the rules for this challenge was to not use the Rush Jet glitch, which is very commonly used on this fight with Rush Jet and Topspin to instantly KO the boss, but I did not allow this. Here we are, the classic difficult stage in all challenge playthroughs of Mega Man: The Refights. Wily 4 starts out with some non-trivial junk golem sections, and you definitely don't want to get hit here. They take 6 Mega Buster shots, and moving around consistently will always result in their defeat, but it is scary with the game's lag and how their projectiles track Mega Man's position. Onto the refights. The Needle Man fight was quite scary and close quarters. I missed one shot against Snake Man, which resulted in us dodging each other for a while, but I managed to make it through. Sparkman gives me a very nice pattern, and Shadow Man generally cooperates too. Magnet Man and Gemini both go down easily. Hardman was a successful and clean fight, but I was especially nervous on his fight because of how tight it is on execution. Finally, Top Man was a simple fight and the refights are over. The beginning of refights were rough, but the end was very nice and clean. Wily 5 is the penultimate stage, so close to the end. This fight is very straightforward and will be the same every time, but you do have to time some slides and not mess up any inputs. Wily Machine goes down to a combination of Search Snake on phase 1 and Rush Jet on phase 2. Moving very consistently in this fight is important. It's especially important to take your pause menu at the right time so that Wily Machine's bullets do not awkwardly home in at you while you are leaving a menu. But it goes well here, and off to the final stage. Wily 6, the end of the run. As I noted before, this is one of the easier final bosses in all of classic Mega Man, but it still guards the end and you have to take it seriously. My fight here was kinda chaotic. I was trying to safely navigate to the top section after dealing 6 hits with Shadow Blade, but I got tripped up on waiting for the right cycle. After making it to the top, I had to do 3 rounds of Search Snake attacks instead of 2 like I usually do, but I managed to stay calm and dodge the final projectile attack and finally defeated Gamma. It's finally over. Mega Man 3 was the 7th game in the classic Mega Man series I beat without taking damage after 1, 2, 6, 7, 8, and 9. This game was the major hurdle. I knew going into this whole challenge that this game would be the hardest by far, and that was 100% accurate. There are so many difficult parts about this game, ranging from the incredibly hard bosses to Mega Man 3's very particular system mechanics. But after a lot of preparation and attempts, I finally did it. It was worth all the effort, and I'm coming reasonably close to finishing this challenge for the series. Only 5 more to go. Thank you for watching. If you like this video and the style of the content, please consider subscribing to the channel and let me know your feedback in the comments. See you for the next one.